You're too slow. It's a taunt that has echoed through 3 decades of gaming history, delivered by a blue hedgehog with an attitude problem and a need for speed. But the phrase carries a deeper irony than Sonic Team ever intended. For much of the 2000s, Sonic the Hedgehog wasn't moving too fast. He was stumbling, struggling, and desperately searching for direction. The franchise that once defined cool in the 1990s had become gaming's most reliable punchline, a cautionary tale of ambition outpacing execution, of corporate pressure crushing creative vision, and of a beloved character lost in an identity crisis that lasted nearly 2 decades. Yet today, in the 2020s, something remarkable has happened. Sonic is fast again, and not just in the games, but in cultural relevance. A critically acclaimed 2D platformer developed by passionate fans. A blockbuster movie that grossed over $400 million worldwide. A franchise that has learned to respect its own legacy while daring to experiment. The Blue Blur's journey from revolutionary competitor to cultural punchline to unexpected renaissance is more than just a video game story. It's a mirror held up to the entire gaming industry, reflecting lessons about what happens when corporations prioritize speed over quality, and what becomes possible when they finally listen. Sonic the Hedgehog's 30-plus year history spans 5 console generations, countless development teams, and a creative vision that has been reinvented, abandoned, and resurrected more times than most franchises ever exist. It's a story of a character created to dethrone Mario, who instead became a symbol of the underdog spirit itself. It's a narrative about the collision between corporate ambition and fan passion, between the desire to innovate and the need to honor what made something special in the first place. Most importantly, it's proof that even the most troubled legacies can be resurrected, not through nostalgia alone, but through humility, community engagement, and a genuine commitment to quality. This essay traces Sonic's 3-act journey. First, the revolutionary rise of the early 1990s, when a blue hedgehog challenged Nintendo's dominance and captured the imagination of a generation. Second, the painful downfall spanning from the mid-1990s through the 2010s, when experimental games, corporate pressure, and creative confusion transformed Sonic into a franchise defined by failure. And finally, the surprising uprise of the late 2000s and 2020, when fan-driven projects, mainstream success, and a renewed focus on quality began restoring what was lost. Along the way, we'll explore why Sonic's story matters beyond gaming. It's a lesson in how communities preserve culture, how corporations can learn from mistakes, and how passion can outlast even the most damaging missteps. Sonic's greatest victory isn't beating Mario, it's surviving itself. By the late 1980s, Nintendo had achieved something that seemed impossible: total dominance of the video game industry. The Nintendo Entertainment System had resurrected gaming from the crash of 1983, and Super Mario Bros. Had become not just a game, but a cultural phenomenon. Mario wasn't simply a character. He was the mascot that defined what video games could be, a mustachioed plumber who had single-handedly saved an entire medium. For Nintendo, this dominance translated into market control so complete that competitors seemed almost irrelevant. Sega, the Japanese arcade giant attempting to break into the home console market with its Genesis, known as the Mega Drive in most regions, faced an uphill battle. The company had tried before to create a mascot that could rival Mario's appeal. Alex Kidd, a young boy with inexplicable martial arts powers, had been Sega's answer to Nintendo's plumber. But Alex Kidd never captured the imagination of players the way Mario had. He was competent, even charming, but he lacked something essential, a quality that transcended the game itself and became part of youth culture. By the late 1980s, it was clear to Sega's leadership that they needed more than just a good game. They needed a character who could become an icon, a mascot, who could stand toe-to-toe with Mario and claim a generation as their own. The stakes were enormous. In the 16-bit era, the console wars weren't just about hardware specifications or game libraries. They were about identity, about which company understood what kids wanted, what was cool, what mattered. Sega needed to win that cultural battle, and they knew it would require something revolutionary. The team tasked with creating Sega's answer to Mario was Sonic Team. led by programmer Yuji Naka and character designer Naoto Oshima. What made their approach different from Nintendo's was fundamental. Instead of building a character around precision platforming, they decided to build one around speed. Mario's genius lay in tight controls and carefully calibrated jumps. Every pixel mattered. Every movement was deliberate. Sonic would be the opposite. He would move with momentum, with physics that felt alive and dynamic. Players wouldn't carefully position themselves for jumps. They would build up speed, trust the level design, and let physics carry them forward. This wasn't just a gameplay difference, it was a philosophical one, where Mario felt controlled and methodical. Sonic felt wild and free. The character design reflected this philosophy perfectly. Oshima's creation was a blue hedgehog with an attitude problem, a character who didn't walk so much as dash, who didn't stand still but tapped his foot impatiently, who looked at the camera with a smirk that suggested he knew something you didn't. The name Sonic was perfect. It evoked speed, sound, something cutting through the air. The hedgehog design was equally inspired. The spikes naturally suggested motion, and the silhouette was so distinctive that you could recognize Sonic from a distance, a crucial quality for a mascot. But what truly set Sonic apart was his personality. While Mario was everyman, Sonic was cool. He had attitude. He was the character for kids who thought Mario was a little too wholesome, a little too earnest. Sonic winked at the camera. Sonic had an edge. Sonic was, in the most 1990s sense possible, radical. The technical achievement behind Sonic was equally revolutionary. Naka and his team had to program momentum-based physics on Genesis hardware that was less powerful than what Nintendo had available. They created levels that flowed organically with loops and springs and curves that made speed feel natural rather than forced. Green Hill Zone, the iconic first level, became the template for what Sonic could be. A space where speed was rewarded, where exploration felt natural, where the level design itself seemed to guide you forward. When Sonic the Hedgehog launched in 1991, it was an instant critical success. The game proved that there was more than one way to make a great platformer, that speed could be just as engaging as precision, that attitude could matter as much as mechanics. Sonic 2 arrived in 1992 and introduced Miles Tails Prower, Sonic's loyal fox sidekick with helicopter-like twin tails. The sequel became a massive sales phenomenon, validating everything Sega had bet on. By 1994, with the release of Sonic 3 and Knuckles, a game so ambitious it was split across 2 cartridges, the franchise had reached its creative peak. Knuckles the Echidna, the guardian of the Master Emerald, joined the cast, and the level design reached new heights of sophistication. There were rumors that Michael Jackson had contributed to Sonic 3's legendary soundtrack, adding another layer of cultural cachet to the franchise. By the mid-1990s, Sonic wasn't just a video game character, he was everywhere. Saturday morning cartoons, comic books, action figures, lunchboxes. Sonic had achieved what Sega set out to do. He had challenged Mario's dominance and won a generation of players who saw themselves in the blue hedgehog's attitude and speed. For a brief, shining moment, Sonic the Hedgehog was the coolest thing in gaming. The Sega Saturn launched in 1994 with a problem that would define the next decade of Sonic's existence. The blue hedgehog was nowhere to be found. While Sony's PlayStation and Nintendo's upcoming N64 were preparing their flagship mascots for the leap to 3D, Sonic was conspicuously absent from Sega's new hardware. The Saturn itself was a troubled console from the start, a surprise early launch in North America that alienated retailers, a complex dual-processor architecture that made development difficult, and a price point that couldn't compete with Sony's aggressive positioning. But for Sonic fans, the most troubling aspect was the silence. Where was their hedgehog? What was Sonic Team doing? The answer, it turned out, was that Sonic Team was working on something else entirely. Yuji Naka and his core team had become fascinated with a new project called Nights into Dreams, an experimental flying game that had nothing to do with Sonic. It was a creative decision that made sense from an artistic standpoint. Why shouldn't talented developers explore new ideas? But it left Sonic in limbo at the exact moment when the franchise needed a clear vision for its future. What Sonic got instead during the Saturn years was a series of of experimental titles that seemed to confuse the brand more than expand it. Sonic 3D Blast, 1996, attempted to bring Sonic into an isometric 3D perspective, but the result felt sluggish and awkward, stripping away the very speed that defined the character. Sonic R, 1997, was a racing game with a memorably bizarre soundtrack but gameplay that felt more like a tech demo than a fully realized concept. Sonic Jam, 1997, was essentially a compilation of the Genesis games with a small 3D hub world. A greatest hits package that inadvertently emphasized how little new Sonic content existed. These weren't terrible games, exactly, but they felt like placeholders, experiments, attempts to do something with Sonic without really understanding what that something should be. The central crisis facing Sonic Team and Sega was fundamental. How does Sonic work in 3D? The character's entire identity was built around momentum-based physics in a 2D plane, where players could see what was coming and react to the level design flowing past them. In 3 dimensions, that became exponentially more complex. How do you maintain speed when the camera needs to constantly reorient? How do you design levels that feel fast without becoming incomprehensible? How do you preserve the precision of the Genesis games while adding an entire new axis of movement? The pressure intensified when Super Mario 64 launched in 1996 and immediately demonstrated how to translate a 2D platforming icon into 3D space. Nintendo's approach was methodical and brilliant. They slowed Mario down, gave players precise control in a 360-degree environment, and built worlds designed for exploration rather than speed. It was the opposite of what Sonic represented, but it worked perfectly. Mario 64 became the template for 3D platformers, and suddenly Sonic looked lost by comparison. Sega had no answer. The Saturn era ended with Sonic's momentum completely stalled. The franchise that had defined the early 1990s now struggling to find relevance in the late 1990s. When Sonic Adventure launched alongside the Sega Dreamcast in 1999, it felt like redemption. Here, finally, was Sonic in full 3D, running through gorgeous environments with a sense of speed that actually felt like Sonic. The game was ambitious in ways that went beyond just graphics. It featured 6 playable characters with completely different gameplay styles, a virtual pet system called Chow Garden that became unexpectedly addictive, and a cinematic storytelling approach that tried to give Sonic's world real dramatic weight. Adventure City, Station Square, the Mystic Ruins. These were locations with personality, with NPCs, with a sense of place that the Genesis games had only hinted at. The game was a critical success, praised for its technical achievement and its willingness to take risks. For a moment, it seemed like Sonic Team had figured it out, had found the formula for translating Sonic into the modern era. But even in that success, there were warning signs that would become more pronounced over time. The camera system was frequently problematic, struggling to keep up with Sonic's speed and often positioning itself in ways that made platforming frustrating rather than fun. The multiple character gameplay, while ambitious, meant that players who just wanted to play as Sonic had to slog through fishing levels as Big the Cat or treasure hunting as Knuckles. The tonal inconsistency was jarring. Sonic's levels felt like classic Sonic, but then you'd switch to Amy's horror game-inspired escape sequences or E102, Gamma's surprisingly melancholic robot storyline. These weren't deal breakers in 1999. But they established patterns that would plague the franchise for years. The tendency to overcomplicate, to add features that diluted the core experience, to chase ambition at the expense of focus. Sonic Adventure 2 arrived in 2001 as a refinement of the formula, streamlining some elements while doubling down on others. The game is remembered fondly by many fans for its improved Sonic/Shadow levels, its memorable soundtrack, and its expanded Chow Garden. But it also represented the franchise's growing identity crisis. Half the game was spent playing as characters who weren't Sonic, doing things that didn't feel like Sonic gameplay. Still, Adventure 2 was a commercial success, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the Dreamcast might give Sega the foothold it needed to compete with Sony and Nintendo. Then, everything collapsed. The Dreamcast, despite its technical superiority and critically acclaimed library, was a commercial failure. Sega had been hemorrhaging money for years, and the Saturn's poor performance had left the company in a weakened position. In January 2001, Sega made the announcement that would change Sonic's trajectory forever. They were exiting the hardware business entirely. No more consoles, no more competing with Sony and Nintendo on their own terms. Sega would become a third-party software developer, and Sonic, the character created specifically to be Sega's answer to Mario, the mascot who existed to sell Sega hardware, would now appear on his rivals' platforms. It was a stunning reversal, a moment that fundamentally altered what Sonic meant. The blue hedgehog who had defined the console wars was now a soldier without a country, a mascot without a home. See the multi-platform identity crisis almost overnight. Sonic went from being Sega's exclusive flagship to appearing everywhere simultaneously. Sonic Advance on the Game Boy Advance, Sonic Heroes on GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Xbox. Sonic games on platforms that had once been the enemy. For Sega, this was a business necessity. They needed to maximize their audience to survive as a software-only company. But for Sonic as a character and a brand, it created a profound identity crisis. Part of what had made Sonic special was his exclusivity, the sense that owning a Sega console meant you were part of a specific gaming culture, a tribe that valued speed and attitude over Nintendo's family-friendly precision. When Sonic appeared on a GameCube, that tribal identity evaporated. He was just another platformer character, competing for attention in a crowded marketplace. The pressure to produce content for multiple platforms simultaneously led to a scattershot approach that confused the brand further. Sonic Team was now expected to deliver games across handheld and home consoles, across different hardware architectures, across different regional markets, with different expectations. The result was a period of relentless experimentation that felt less like creative exploration and more like throwing ideas at the wall to see what stuck. Sonic Heroes, 2003, attempted to recapture the Genesis era's simplicity by organizing characters into teams, but the execution felt clunky and the level design repetitive. Shadow the Hedgehog, 2005, gave Sonic's edgy rival his own game complete with guns, vehicles, and a morality system that felt bizarrely out of place in a Sonic title. The game's marketing featured Shadow holding a firearm with the tagline, "Vengeance is his," a tonal choice so far removed from Sonic's origins that it became a punchline. The character roster was expanding at an alarming rate, each new game introducing new faces with new gimmicks. Rouge the Bat, Cream the Rabbit, Silver the Hedgehog, Blaze the Cat. The cast grew so large that it became difficult to remember who anyone was or why they mattered. Each character came with their own gameplay style, their own backstory, their own place in an increasingly convoluted mythology. What had once been a simple story, fast hedgehog fights, evil scientist, had become a sprawling narrative universe with time travel, alternate dimensions, ancient prophecies, and apocalyptic stakes. The tonal whiplash was constant. One game would try to be kid-friendly and colorful. The next would attempt dark, serious storytelling with genuine dramatic stakes. Sonic couldn't decide what it wanted to be, and the audience couldn't figure out what to expect. The franchise that had once had such a clear identity, speed, attitude, fun, now felt like it was trying to be everything to everyone and succeeding at being nothing to anyone. D. The Nadir, Sonic 2006 and the Experimental Disaster. If there's a single moment when Sonic's reputation collapsed completely, it was November 14th, 2006, when Sonic the Hedgehog, often called Sonic 06, to distinguish it from the 1991 original, launched on Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. The game was intended as a grand reboot, a return to form that would re-establish Sonic as a premier gaming franchise for the new console generation. The ambition was enormous. Photorealistic graphics, a serious dramatic storyline involving time travel and apocalyptic prophecy, multiple playable characters with interwoven narratives, and a physics engine designed to make Sonic's speed feel more realistic and weighty. On paper, it sounded like exactly what the franchise needed, a bold reinvention that would prove Sonic could compete with the technical and narrative sophistication of modern gaming. In execution, Sonic 2006 was a catastrophe. The game was rushed to meet the Xbox 360 and PS3 launch windows, and the development timeline simply wasn't sufficient for the scope of what Sonic Team was attempting. The result was a game so broken, so fundamentally unfinished, that it became legendary for all the wrong reasons. The loading screens were endless. Players would wait 30 seconds or more just to retry a section after dying, which happened frequently because the physics engine was wildly inconsistent. Sonic would clip through solid geometry, get stuck in walls, or suddenly launch into the air for no apparent reason. The camera system was even worse than in the adventure games, frequently positioning itself in ways that made it impossible to see where you were going. Platforming sections that required precision were rendered nearly impossible by controls that felt simultaneously too loose and too sticky. The game wasn't just difficult, it was unfair in ways that felt like the developers hadn't actually tested their own product. But the technical problems, as severe as they were, weren't even the most mocked aspect of Sonic 2006. That distinction belonged to the game's storyline, which featured a romantic subplot between Sonic and a human princess named Elise. The cutscenes depicting their relationship were awkward and uncomfortable, culminating in a scene where Elise kisses Sonic's corpse to bring him back to life, an image that became instantly infamous and was memed relentlessly across the internet. It was a narrative choice that fundamentally misunderstood what players wanted from a Sonic game, a tonal misstep so severe that it overshadowed everything else about the project. The game was savaged by critics, receiving some of the lowest review scores ever given to a major franchise release. More importantly, it became a cultural punchline, the go-to example of how not to make a video game. The damage from Sonic 2006 extended far beyond just one bad game. It crystallized a narrative about Sonic that would persist for years, that the franchise was creatively bankrupt, that Sonic Team didn't understand their own character, that any new Sonic game was likely to be a disaster. The pattern continued with Sonic Unleashed in 2008, a game that actually introduced one of the franchise's best innovations, the boost formula that would define modern Sonic gameplay, but ruined it by forcing players to spend half the game playing as the werehog, a slow, combat-focused transformation that felt like it belonged in a completely different game. The Storybook series, Sonic and the Secret Rings, 2007, and Sonic and the Black Knight, 2009, were more experiments that felt disconnected from what made Sonic special. Motion-controlled adventures that seemed designed more around the Wii's capabilities than around Sonic's identity. A pattern had emerged, and it was damning. Ambitious concepts undermined by poor execution and unnecessary gimmicks. Sonic Team kept trying to innovate, kept trying to find new ways to make Sonic relevant, but they seemed to have lost sight of what made the character work in the first place. Every game felt like it was chasing trends rather than setting them, adding features because other games had them, rather than because they served Sonic's core gameplay. The franchise that had once been defined by its confidence and clarity now felt desperate and confused. Why the downfall happened. The collapse of Sonic's reputation wasn't the result of laziness or lack of effort. If anything, it was the opposite. Sonic Team was trying too hard, attempting too much, chasing too many ideas simultaneously without the focus or development time to execute any of them properly. The root cause was corporate pressure from Sega, a company that needed Sonic to be a reliable revenue stream and demanded annual or near-annual releases to compete in a marketplace dominated by massive franchises like Mario, Halo, and Grand Theft Auto. That release schedule was incompatible with the kind of careful, iterative development that great games require. Sonic 2006 was rushed to meet a console launch window. Unleashed was pushed out before the werehog concept was properly refined. The experimental period wasn't about creative exploration. It was about desperation, about trying to find a formula that would work under impossible constraints. The departure of Yuji Naka in 2006, right as Sonic 06 was falling apart, symbolized the loss of creative vision that had guided the franchise through its best years. Naka had been there from the beginning, had programmed the physics that made Sonic feel unique, had understood intuitively what made the character special. Without that institutional knowledge and creative leadership, Sonic Team seemed to lose its way, chasing innovation for innovation's sake rather than building on the foundation that had made Sonic great. The franchise began misunderstanding its own appeal, assuming that what players wanted was constant novelty rather than refinement of core mechanics. The technical challenges of translating Sonic's speed and momentum into 3D environments were real and significant, but they were solvable problems, as later games would eventually prove. What made them unsolvable during this period was the lack of time and resources to actually solve them. Instead of taking years to perfect a 3D Sonic engine, Sonic Team was expected to ship games on annual cycles, meaning they were constantly starting over, constantly experimenting, never given the space to iterate and improve. The overcomplication of the franchise, too many characters, convoluted storylines, unnecessary gameplay mechanics, was a symptom of the same problem. When you don't have confidence in your core gameplay, you add features to compensate, hoping that quantity will make up for lack of quality. By the early 2000s, the damage was done. Sonic had gone from being one of gaming's coolest icons to being a punchline. A franchise that inspired more mockery than excitement. Fan frustration had reached critical mass, with longtime supporters openly questioning whether Sonic Team was capable of making a good game anymore. The blue hedgehog who had once challenged Mario for gaming supremacy was now struggling just to be taken seriously. The downfall was complete, and the question facing the franchise was existential. Could Sonic ever recover? Or was this simply what the character had become? A relic of the 1990s, forever chasing a glory that could never be recaptured. 4. The Uprising A. The first signs of recovery. The answer came in 2010 from an unexpected source. The Nintendo Wii. Sonic Colors was announced as a Wii and DS exclusive, a decision that seemed almost quaint in an era when major franchises were expected to launch simultaneously across all platforms. But that exclusivity was part of what made Colors special. It was a game designed specifically for the Wii's capabilities and audience, rather than a compromised product trying to be everything to everyone. More importantly, Colors represented a fundamental shift in philosophy. There were no werehog transformations, no gun-wielding edgelord storylines, no sprawling cast of characters with their own gameplay styles. It was just Sonic running through colorful levels, collecting rings and fighting Dr. Eggman. The game stripped away all the accumulated baggage of the experimental era and asked a simple question: what if we just made Sonic fun again? The level design in Colors was tight, focused, and clearly play-tested to death. The new wisps, alien creatures that granted temporary power-ups, were integrated seamlessly into the gameplay, rather than feeling like a gimmick bolted on for marketing purposes. The writing was self-aware and genuinely funny, acknowledging Sonic's personality without drowning in melodrama. Most importantly, the game felt finished, polished, like a product that had been given the time and resources it needed to be good. When Colors launched in November 2010, the critical reception was the best Sonic had seen in over a decade. Review scores hovered in the 7 to 8 range, not revolutionary, but solid, respectable proof that Sonic Team could still make a competent game. For a franchise that had spent years being savaged by critics, that felt like vindication. The momentum continued with Sonic Generations in 2011, a celebration of the franchise's 20th anniversary that did something brilliant. It acknowledged both versions of Sonic. The game featured classic Sonic playing through reimagined 2D levels from the Genesis era, and modern Sonic playing through 3D interpretations of those same stages using the boost formula refined in Colors. It was a love letter to the franchise's history that didn't pretend the last 15 years hadn't happened, but instead found a way to honor both eras. Generations was even better received than Colors, with critics praising its level design, its nostalgic appeal, and its demonstration that Sonic Team finally understood what made their character work. The game sold well, won awards, and most importantly, it made people excited about Sonic again. Longtime fans who had abandoned the franchise started paying attention. The narrative was shifting from Sonic is a disaster to Sonic might actually be good again, but uncertainty remained. Two good games didn't erase a decade of failures. The question wasn't whether Sonic Team could make one or two quality titles. It was whether they could sustain that quality, whether this represented a genuine understanding of what had gone wrong or just a lucky streak. The franchise was no longer in crisis, but it wasn't yet secure. Sonic had proven he could still run fast. Now he needed to prove he could keep running without tripping over his own feet. What these middle years revealed was that Sonic was no longer making Sonic 06 level disasters, but the franchise still hadn't achieved consistency. Each game felt like a different experiment, a different attempt to figure out what modern Sonic should be. The fan community was growing increasingly vocal, not with the resigned mockery of the experimental era, but with genuine frustration born from caring. They had seen that Sonic Team could make good games. Colors and Generations proved it, so why couldn't they do it consistently? The uncertainty wasn't about whether Sonic could be good. It was about whether Sega would let him be good, whether the corporate pressure and creative indecision that had plagued the franchise for years had truly been resolved or just temporarily suppressed. See Mania, the fan-driven renaissance. The answer to what Sonic could be, when given proper respect and development time, came from an unexpected source: the fans themselves. Sonic Mania, announced in 2016 and released in August 2017, was developed not by Sonic Team, but by a collaboration of fan developers who had spent years creating Sonic ROM hacks and fan games. Christian Whitehead, who had previously developed mobile ports of the classic Sonic games, led the project alongside studios Headcanon and Pagoda West Games, teams composed of people who had grown up loving Sonic and had spent years studying what made those Genesis games special. Sega's decision to empower these developers, rather than keeping everything in-house, was itself a statement of humility, an acknowledgement that passion and expertise could exist outside the corporate structure. Mania was a pure return to the 2D classic formula, but it wasn't simply nostalgia bait or a lazy retread. The game featured a mix of reimagined classic zones and entirely new levels, all designed with a deep understanding of what made Sonic's momentum-based physics so satisfying. The level design was intricate and layered, rewarding exploration and mastery in ways that felt like a natural evolution of the Genesis games rather than a regression. The sprite work was gorgeous, the soundtrack was phenomenal, and the game ran at a buttery smooth 60 frames per second. Every element felt crafted with love and attention to detail. The product of developers who understood Sonic not as a corporate asset to be exploited, but as a character worth celebrating. When Sonic Mania launched, the critical reception was rapturous. Major gaming outlets gave it scores in the 8 to 9 range, with many calling it the best Sonic game in decades. Some even argued it was the best Sonic game ever made, surpassing even the Genesis classics. The game was a commercial success, selling over 1 million copies in its first month, and continuing to sell steadily long after launch. More importantly, Mania proved something fundamental. The original Sonic formula was never broken. The problem had never been that 2D Sonic was outdated or that the character needed constant reinvention to stay relevant. The problem was that the franchise had abandoned what made it special in a desperate attempt to chase trends and compete in a market that didn't require Sonic to be anything other than himself. Sonic Mania Plus, released in 2018, expanded the game with new playable characters, Mighty the Armadillo and Ray the Flying Squirrel, deep cuts from Sonic's obscure history, and additional content, along with a physical release that became a collector's item. The success of Mania validated the fan community's passion and demonstrated that respecting the franchise's legacy wasn't the same as being trapped by it. Innovation didn't require abandoning what worked. It required understanding why it worked and building on that foundation. Mania became a rallying point for the Sonic community, proof that when the character was treated with care and expertise, he could still be extraordinary. D. The Hollywood phenomenon. While Mania was winning over critics and longtime fans, Sonic was about to reach an entirely different audience through the most unlikely medium, Hollywood. The announcement of a live-action Sonic the Hedgehog movie in 2018 was met with cautious optimism that quickly turned to horror when the first trailer dropped in April 2019. The initial design for Sonic was a nightmare, a bizarrely realistic hedgehog with human-like teeth, small eyes, and proportions that fell deep into the uncanny valley. The internet's reaction was immediate and brutal. Memes mocking the design flooded social media. Fans expressed genuine distress at what had been done to their character, and the backlash was so intense that it became a mainstream news story. What happened next was unprecedented. Paramount Pictures and director Jeff Fowler actually listened. They delayed the film's release, went back to the drawing board, and completely redesigned Sonic to look like, well, Sonic. Big eyes, proper proportions, the iconic design that fans recognized and loved.